Marissa has spent weeks telling Edward that she needs more from him.
What is it, hon?
Be more assertive. Tell me what you're thinking. Stop holding everything inside. And then Edward finally starts doing exactly that.
Because it's around.
Stop
They're
interrupting
fighting
me.
again.
I told
That is
you
what makes this restaurant
exactly
argument
why
so
I
much
got
more
upset.
interesting
I
than
hear
just
you. I
another
told you.
awkward
Don't make sense.
90-day fiance date gone wrong.
Well, then let it
Because
make
on the
sense.
surface,
That is a
this looks like
privacy
two
mindset,
people
in my
getting
opinion,
irritated
okay?
over jealousy.
Marissa,
Tone,
everything that you're doing right now,
timing,
Right now, what I
interruptions,
doing?
and
You
who
doing?
said what
I'm not doing
first.
nothing.
But underneath that argument, I think we're watching a much
don't
bigger
need a napkin,
relationship
Edward.
problem finally
A
become
few
impossible
moments
to ignore.
later.
Edward says something Marissa doesn't like. Marissa feels like he picked the wrong moment to bring it up. Edward tries to explain what he meant. Marissa feels embarrassed and starts correcting the way he's communicating. Edward feels misunderstood, gets defensive, and eventually starts giving her those sarcastic, "Okay, you're right, everything you say is right" responses. Then he leaves. He cools off. He comes back. He apologizes. And somehow, even that doesn't actually solve anything. And that raises the question I think viewers are really arguing about right now. Does Marissa genuinely want Edward to become more confident and expressive? Or does she want him to become confident and expressive only when what he's saying makes her comfortable? Because those are two completely different things. And Edward is definitely not innocent here either. The patience we saw earlier in the season is starting to crack. He's getting sarcastic. He's shutting down. He's walking away. So with the 90-day clock running, money problems coming into the conversation, and even more wedding pressure ahead, this restaurant fight might have exposed the exact reason these two keep getting stuck. And it has almost nothing to do with jealousy. What really stood out to me about this fight is that Edward seems to be trapped inside what is basically a communication double bind. A double bind is when somebody receives two expectations that sound reasonable separately, but become almost impossible to satisfy at the same time. And that is exactly what this relationship is starting to look like. Marissa wants Edward to express himself, but not during the wrong moment. She wants him to be assertive, but not argumentative. She wants him to challenge her, but not in a way that embarrasses her. She wants him to communicate honestly, but she also seems extremely sensitive to his tone, timing, delivery, facial expression, volume, and attitude. Now, let me be very clear here. None of those expectations are automatically unreasonable. Nobody wants their partner bringing up a negative issue in the middle of what was supposed to be a nice evening. Nobody wants to be yelled at. Nobody wants a conversation turning into sarcasm and attitude. The problem comes when somebody is already nervous about speaking up, and then every imperfect attempt to speak up becomes another thing they're corrected for. Because eventually that person stops thinking, how do I communicate better? They start thinking, what answer am I supposed to give so this doesn't become another fight? And that is a very dangerous shift in a relationship. Edward appears to believe that he's finally doing what Marissa has asked him to do. He's telling her when something bothers him. He's actually putting feelings into words instead of quietly going along with everything. But Marissa seems to experience some of those moments not as progress, but as evidence that Edward is becoming difficult. And I think that contradiction is exactly why so many viewers are frustrated with her right now. Because if you spend weeks saying, I need you to speak up, eventually you have to accept that the person speaking up might say something you don't agree with. That is the entire point. Real communication is not your partner becoming better at delivering the answers you already wanted. Real communication means sometimes hearing something inconvenient, sometimes hearing something badly phrased, sometimes hearing something at the wrong time, sometimes having to ask, okay, what were you actually trying to say? Instead of immediately reacting to the delivery. And to be fair, Edward has work to do here too. Because once Edward feels misunderstood, he doesn't always become clearer. He becomes sarcastic. That whole energy of, fine, you're right, everything you say is right, is not healthy communication. That is passive aggression. It might feel satisfying in the moment because you're basically telling the other person, there's no point talking to you. But that doesn't solve anything. Actually, it makes the other person feel even more justified in thinking you have an attitude. And this is why the cycle between these two is becoming so self-reinforcing. Marissa believes Edward is not communicating properly. Edward believes Marissa doesn't actually want to hear him. So Edward gets defensive. Marissa sees the defensiveness and thinks, see, this is exactly the attitude I'm talking about. Edward sees her correcting him again and thinks, see, she never wanted honesty. She wanted obedience. And around they go. At some point, they're not even arguing about the original issue anymore. They're arguing about the way they're arguing. And once a couple gets there, things can become exhausting very quickly. That was one of the biggest reactions I saw reflected in viewer discussions too. A lot of people weren't even focused on the jealousy itself. They were watching two people become angry about how the other person was reacting instead of actually resolving what started the disagreement. And that tells you something. When the process of communication becomes more emotionally charged than the subject you're communicating about, the relationship has a bigger problem than whatever started that day's argument. But I think there is another layer here that makes Marissa and Edward especially complicated. This relationship has never really started from an equal playing field. Marissa is older. She is established. She has children. She has a professional identity. She already has a household, a routine, a social circle, expectations, responsibilities, and a very specific idea of what her adult life looks like. Edward is entering that world. And I think that phrase matters. He is entering her world. He's not arriving in a neutral place where they're building a new life together from scratch. He's trying to figure out where he fits into something Marissa has already built. Her home, her family structure, her friends, her professional environment, her country, her expectations. And naturally, Edward has to adapt. Of course he does. Moving to another country and entering a household with children means you cannot just show up and say, "Everybody adjust to me." That would be ridiculous. But adaptation has to happen in both directions if this is going to become a marriage instead of an extended audition. And that is where I think Marissa struggles. Because sometimes the way she talks to Edward feels less like two adults negotiating a shared life and more like one person evaluating whether another person meets the requirements for a position. And I know that sounds harsh, but honestly, viewers have been making versions of that joke all season. Sometimes it feels like Edward is being onboarded into Marissa Incorporated. Okay, Edward, here are the household expectations. Here's how I need you to present yourself. Here's how I need you to behave socially. Here's how I need you to interact with the family. Here's how I need you to communicate. Here's how assertive I need you to be. Actually, not like that. Adjust the assertiveness. Lower the tone. Change the timing. Try again. And the irony is that Marissa seems frustrated because she wants a partner who feels like an equal. But if one person is constantly managing the other person's behavior, that can actually create the exact dependence they claim not to want. Think about it. The more you direct someone, the less room they have to make decisions. The more you correct someone, the more cautious they become. The more cautious they become, the less initiative they take. Then you turn around and say, "Why am I responsible for everything? Why don't you take initiative?" That is a real relationship trap. And I'm not diagnosing Marissa or saying she's intentionally creating this dynamic. We are talking about the behavior we're being shown on television. But based on what the season has presented, there is a pattern where Marissa seems to want Edward to become more independent while also maintaining a lot of control over what that independence is supposed to look like. That's very difficult. And it raises a question that goes way beyond this couple. How much adaptation can you reasonably expect from the partner who moved countries before adaptation starts turning into assimilation? Because there's a difference between saying, "You need to respect my household," and saying, "You need to become the version of a husband that already exists in my imagination." Edward needs to learn Marissa's world. But Marissa has to make room for Edward to influence that world too. Otherwise, he's not actually becoming her partner. He's becoming somebody who is expected to successfully fit into the life she already had. And I think social class makes that even more sensitive. Their storyline has emphasized from the beginning that they come from very different economic and professional environments. That doesn't automatically make them incompatible. People from different backgrounds marry every day. But it does create a power imbalance that both partners have to be aware of. Marissa already has financial stability and professional status in the United States. Edward is adjusting to immigration, a new environment, new expectations, and a situation where he cannot instantly match the level of independence she has had years to establish. So imagine how certain criticisms might sound from Edward's perspective. Marissa may be saying, "I need to know that you can function as an equal partner." Edward may be hearing, "You are not currently good enough for my life." Those are not necessarily the same statement, but emotionally, they can land almost identically. And that is why communication matters so much here. Because if Marissa doesn't clearly separate, "I need partnership," from "I need you to prove your worth," Edward is going to become more defensive. And if Edward responds to every uncomfortable conversation by becoming sarcastic and walking away, Marissa is going to become even more anxious about whether he can handle adult responsibilities with her. Again, the cycle feeds itself. And I think this is one reason the fan reaction has become so interesting. A lot of viewers are clearly sympathizing with Edward right now. Some fans feel Marissa asks him to speak up and then immediately interrupts, corrects, or invalidates him when he finally does. Some viewers think she talks to him more like someone she is managing than someone she is marrying. And there is definitely a section of the audience that sees their dynamic as almost parent and child instead of adult and adult. But I also think we have to be careful about turning that reaction into, Marissa is terrible and Edward is perfect. Because reality television loves a clean hero and villain story. It makes episodes easier to follow. It makes social media louder. And it makes people emotionally pick a side. But real relationships are usually messier than that. First, we are seeing an edited television version of these people. That matters. We don't know every conversation they've had. We don't know what happened before every scene. We don't know what was cut for time. So when I say Marissa appears controlling in certain conversations, I'm talking about the Marissa being presented on the show. I am not saying we now know every aspect of this woman's personality. And Edward deserves some scrutiny too. There are viewers who have pushed back against the very pro-Edward interpretation of their storyline and basically said, why are we automatically assuming we know everything about his motivations? That's a fair question. There has been online speculation about Edward's background and previous relationships, but speculation is not evidence. I'm not going to treat random internet claims as confirmed facts. What I do think is fair to say is that when a reality show gives us a very obvious sympathetic partner and a very obvious difficult partner, it's worth asking what context we might not be seeing. Because that happens all the time in this franchise. People look completely different once more information comes out. And there's another interpretation of Marissa that I actually think is more interesting than simply calling her controlling. Some viewers think she may be self-sabotaging, not intentionally destroying the relationship, but constantly testing it because she is uncomfortable with uncertainty. And again, that is viewer interpretation, not a psychological diagnosis. But look at the pattern we've been shown. She wants Edward to fit into the household. Then she worries about initiative. Then family becomes part of the evaluation. Then social compatibility becomes part of the evaluation. Then assertiveness becomes part of the evaluation. Now communication style becomes part of the evaluation.
There always seems to be one more test.
And every relationship needs standards, especially when you have children and you are bringing somebody into your home. Marissa absolutely should ask serious questions. But there is a difference between having standards and continuously moving the finish line. Because if Edward feels like every time he satisfies one requirement, another one appears, he may eventually stop believing success is possible. And once somebody believes they can't win, they usually do one of three things.
They shut down.
They rebel. Or they leave. We're starting to see pieces of all three from Edward. Earlier in the season, he seemed much more willing to absorb criticism. Now we're seeing more frustration, more sarcasm, more willingness to walk away, more moments where his patience looks like it's running out. And that's why I don't think Edward's apology at the restaurant should automatically be viewed as proof that everything is okay. An apology can end a fight. It does not necessarily solve the pattern that created it. And I actually think that is one of the most important things happening with this couple. Edward can apologize. Marissa can calm down. They can hug. They can go home. But unless they understand why these conversations keep turning into the same fight, nothing has changed. The next subject will just replace jealousy. And according to the upcoming episode information, money is about to become a much bigger issue. That is where things could get really difficult. Because jealousy is emotional. Money is emotional and practical. Marriage is emotional, practical, financial, and legal. And if this couple cannot discuss an uncomfortable comment at dinner without immediately getting pulled into tone, disrespect, embarrassment, defensiveness, sarcasm, and walking away, how are they going to handle financial responsibility? How are they going to handle long-term dependence? How are they going to handle work? How are they going to handle bills? How are they going to handle expectations about contribution? How are they going to handle resentment if one person feels like they are carrying more than the other? Those conversations require an even higher level of trust. And this is where their class difference may stop being background context and become the actual conflict. Because Marissa may look at the financial reality of marriage and think, I need to know that Edward will eventually become an equal contributor. That would be a legitimate concern. Edward may hear that same conversation and think, here we go again. Another reason I'm not good enough for you. And both of them could enter the conversation already expecting to be hurt. That is a recipe for disaster. I also think Marissa has another internal contradiction that the season keeps bringing out. She appears afraid Edward is not ready for her world, but she also appears afraid of losing him. And those fears pull her in opposite directions. One fear says, slow down. Question everything. Make sure he's right. The other fear says, don't lose the relationship. That creates this push-pull energy where she wants reassurance but keeps creating tests that increase uncertainty. And then you add the K1 deadline. Now those two fears are racing against a clock. There is no luxury of saying, we'll spend another year figuring this out. Marriage is approaching whether they feel emotionally ready or not. And that is one of the reasons 90-Day Fiancé creates so much chaos. A normal couple can have a horrible fight and say, maybe we should take things slower. One couple can have a horrible fight and then look at the calendar and realize the wedding decision is still sitting right there. The deadline doesn't create every problem, but it absolutely removes the couple's ability to ignore those problems forever. And we already know that upcoming episode descriptions are teasing major financial concerns and an emotional wedding day breakdown for Marissa. That doesn't tell us the final outcome. It doesn't confirm whether they marry. It doesn't confirm a breakup. And I don't think we should pretend it does. But it does tell us that this uncertainty is not disappearing after one restaurant apology. If anything, it looks like the pressure is getting worse. And my prediction is that the financial conversation is going to amplify the parent-child dynamic viewers are already noticing. If Marissa learns that marriage comes with more financial responsibility than she expected, she may become even more focused on whether Edward can become independent. And Edward may become even more sensitive to feeling evaluated. So instead of the conversation being, how do we build a financial plan together? It could easily turn into, Marissa explains what Edward needs to become, and Edward reacts to feeling judged. That would be the worst possible version of the conversation. Because again, one person becomes the manager. The other person becomes the employee defending his performance. And marriage cannot survive very long if that becomes the permanent structure. My second prediction is that Edward's resentment is going to become more visible. I don't think the sarcastic responses and walking away are random. I think they show that whatever patience Edward had earlier is wearing thinner. And that doesn't mean he's about to explode or become some completely different person. It means he may no longer be willing to quietly absorb every criticism just to keep the peace. The question is whether that becomes healthier assertiveness or unhealthy resentment, because those are two very different roads. Healthy assertiveness would sound like, I understand your concern, but I need you to let me finish and I need my opinion to matter too. Resentment sounds like, fine, you're always right. There's no point talking. Right now, Edward seems to be drifting toward the second one when he gets overwhelmed. That has to change, because Marissa may absolutely need to become more comfortable hearing disagreement. But Edward also has to learn how to disagree without turning the conversation into sarcasm and emotional withdrawal. Otherwise, he ends up proving the exact thing she's worried about. And Marissa has to learn that correcting someone's communication while they are already feeling unheard can make them feel even more unheard. Otherwise, she ends up proving the exact thing Edward is worried about. See how perfectly they trigger each other? That's why I don't think this is really a compatibility issue in the simple sense. I think it's a conflict management issue. They don't have a reliable mechanism for disagreement. Marissa feels attacked. Edward feels misunderstood. Marissa tries to regain control of the conversation. Edward becomes defensive. Edward withdraws. Then somebody apologizes. But the actual disagreement never gets fully processed. And if a couple doesn't know how to disagree, every future issue becomes dangerous. Money becomes dangerous. Family becomes dangerous. Parenting becomes dangerous. Work becomes dangerous. Social situations become dangerous. Even small misunderstandings become dangerous because both people already know the argument can quickly become about something much larger. And that's what makes Marissa and Edward more interesting to me than couples where the conflict is obvious. This isn't necessarily one giant scandal. It's a pattern. And patterns are harder to fix than individual incidents. If Edward cheated, you could point at the betrayal. If Marissa discovered some huge lie, you could point at the lie. But what do you point at when the problem is how two people interpret each other every single time they disagree? That requires both people to change. And usually both people believe the other one needs to change first. That's the trap. I also think viewers need to watch what happens when Edward eventually starts making decisions Marissa genuinely cannot control. Because right now, a lot of their conflict happens while Edward is still adjusting. He's still learning. He's still in the weaker structural position. But imagine a year later. Imagine Edward working. Imagine him developing his own social circle. Imagine him becoming financially independent. Imagine him feeling completely comfortable in the United States. Does Marissa like that version of Edward? That is a serious question. Because sometimes people say they want an independent partner, but what they actually enjoy is being the more competent, established, needed person in the relationship. Again, I am not saying that is definitely Marissa. I'm saying the relationship has to survive the power balance changing. Because, ideally, it should change. Edward should become more independent. He should become more confident. He should become more comfortable making decisions. And if Marissa truly wants an equal partner, she should eventually have less control over his life, not more. That transition could be very revealing. At the same time, Edward has to ask himself what he actually wants. Does he want partnership with Marissa? Or is he slowly learning to avoid conflict by apologizing until the immediate problem disappears? Because there is a point where repeatedly apologizing can become its own form of avoidance. You say sorry. The tension drops. You move on. But inside, resentment stays. Then 6 months later, you're not arguing about one restaurant conversation. You're arguing about 20 conversations that never actually got resolved. And that is how people wake up one day and realize they don't even remember why they're angry anymore. They just know they feel criticized, or controlled, or unappreciated, or unheard. That's the long-term danger for these two. And this is also why I don't think the wedding day breakdown that has been teased necessarily needs one gigantic new bombshell behind it. Could there be a new revelation? Absolutely. We don't know yet. But sometimes reality television trains us to expect one dramatic trigger when the real explanation is accumulation. A wedding can bring every unresolved doubt to the surface at once.
Money,
Family, compatibility, immigration, responsibility,
trust,
the fear of making the wrong decision, the fear of losing somebody you love, and the terrifying realization that once you walk down that aisle, these conversations don't disappear. They become your marriage. So, if Marissa breaks down on her wedding day, I'm going to be watching less for the dramatic moment and more for what she says around it. Does she suddenly introduce a completely new concern? Or does she repeat the same concerns we've been hearing all season in a more emotionally intense form? Because if it's the second one, then the restaurant fight was not a random bad date. It was a preview. It showed us two people who care about each other, but still don't know how to make disagreement feel safe. And if disagreement does not feel safe, honesty eventually disappears. One person starts editing themselves. The other person starts becoming suspicious of the silence. Then the first person says, "See? I can't tell you anything." And the second person says, "See? You never communicate with me." That is exactly the contradiction Marissa and Edward need to break. Marissa cannot demand honesty and then punish every uncomfortable version of honesty. Edward cannot demand to be heard and then sabotage his own message with sarcasm. Marissa cannot say she wants a confident adult partner while constantly placing herself in the supervisor role. Edward cannot complain about being treated like a child while responding to conflict by shutting down instead of clearly holding his ground. Both things can be true at the same time. And that is probably why this couple is going to remain so divisive. If you already dislike Marissa, this episode probably confirmed everything you think about her. If you already distrust Edward, his sarcasm probably looked like his real personality finally coming out. If you're somewhere in the middle, you probably watched the fight thinking, can either one of you just let the other person finish a sentence? And honestly, that middle position may be the most useful one. Because the question isn't really who won the argument. Nobody won. Marissa left feeling hurt. Edward left feeling misunderstood. He came back and apologized. But did Marissa actually understand what he was trying to say? Did Edward understand why the timing bothered her? Did either of them leave with a better strategy for the next disagreement? From what we were shown, I'm not convinced. And that is the biggest red flag. Not jealousy. Not the restaurant. Not even the walking away. The red flag is that their conflict has become predictable. Marissa asks for something. Edward tries. Marissa becomes dissatisfied with how he tries. Edward becomes defensive. Marissa becomes more controlling. Edward becomes more passive-aggressive. Then one person backs down. And if they carry that pattern into marriage, the subjects will get bigger while the communication system stays exactly the same. That is not sustainable. So for me, this restaurant fight was never really about one jealous comment. It revealed that Marissa and Edward still do not have a reliable way to disagree without turning disagreement into a judgment of each other's character. Marissa hears Edward's frustration and thinks attitude. Edward hears Marissa's correction and thinks control. Marissa tries to manage the conversation. Edward feels even less heard. Edward walks away. He comes back.
He apologizes.
But neither person seems completely understood. And now they are heading toward conversations about finances, long-term responsibility, and marriage itself. Those conversations require more emotional flexibility than anything we have seen from them so far. Because Marissa's established lifestyle, Edward's transition into the United States, their difference in economic status, their family expectations, and the pressure of the one timeline are not small issues. Those are marriage-level issues. And you cannot manage marriage like an employee performance review. You also cannot survive marriage by sarcastically saying, "Fine, you're always right," every time you feel criticized. At some point, Marissa has to decide whether she genuinely wants Edward to become more assertive even when his assertiveness challenges her. And Edward has to decide whether he can communicate his needs directly without turning frustration into resentment. Because if they cannot do both of those things, the wedding is not going to solve this. It's just going to make the stakes higher.
So, now I want to know what you guys think.
Do you think Marissa genuinely wants Edward to become more confident and assertive? Or do you think she only feels comfortable with Edward speaking up when he agrees with her? And on the other side, is Edward finally standing up for himself? Or are we starting to see passive aggression and resentment replacing healthy communication? Because somewhere between those two answers is probably the real future of this relationship. And with money pressure and the wedding getting closer, I have a feeling we're about to find out very quickly whether these two are actually learning how to become partners or whether Edward is still just trying to pass Marissa's next test.